I'm going to say good evening and welcome to the Global Energy Outlook Forum 2024. But I know for our special guests on this panel, it is actually the early morning or relatively early in their day. We are now on session, I think 18 or 19, started out close to 12 hours ago in Shanghai, looking at the outlook for Asia, and we're through the Middle East and Europe, and now deep in the Americas with lots of interesting discussions on multiple topics. Just closing out an interview on whether the carbon markets, having not been adopted at COP28 recently, will find their way into the American lexicon in 2024. But we are now going around the world. We are looking in this session at the sort of intersection point of politics and energy in this great and very important election year in the United States. I was going to say re-election year, of course. You have to be, but it is an election year in which one candidate can be re-elected. I suppose actually in this case, they could both be in some form of re-election, given that they've both been former presidents. That doesn't happen very often, does it? So probably the first time in our lifetime or in a long time. That seems to be the case these days. Always these great firsts, these sort of black swan moments, if indeed this is one. But I want to kick off with Dr. Rad Al-Qadiri, Managing Director, Energy, Climate and Resources at the Eurasia Group. Of course, the Eurasia Group has recently published their outlook for the year ahead and top 10 things and all of that. But your thoughts, Rad, as to the intersection point. I've titled the session, it's the gasoline price, stupid, which of course is a play on the former claim by in the Clinton presidency of election that it's the economy, stupid. But in this case, it's the gasoline price, stupid, Biden, energy and re-election, what's at stake. But if you would paint a picture to us for that intersection point of this election cycle and the energy sector.
That's great to be here, Sean. Thank you. I think actually it goes well beyond gasoline. I mean, gasoline prices always matter. The economy is what, tends to guide domestic elections all across the world. But I think we're looking at something far more consequential in terms of energy, because this is also going to define the process of energy transitions, and probably shape it sort of for the next decade, depending on who wins. Now, I possibly have moments of reservation that, the two of them may not make it to the starting line of the election. They still have a number of hurdles to get through, age, some legal problems, etc. But I mean, assuming those are the two candidates, you are left with some very stark choices when it comes to energy, and the energy future. On the one hand, an administration that has gambled on green energy and gambled on sort of bolstering green energy as part of an industrialization process, and as part really using the federal government to boost industry, to boost jobs, by using green energy as one of those mechanisms, and also has brought through, the Inflation Reduction Act, certain elements of support for the oil and gas industry as well. It hasn't been forgotten despite some of the critics of the administration. But I think on the other side, what you see is a very, very stark view of the US focusing on energy independence, looking at hydrocarbons, but also questions about US leadership globally, US involvement in climate debate globally, and where the US seeks to position itself. So, I mean, this is probably the most consequential election in the last 30 years. As consequential maybe as 1992, when Bill Clinton came in and sort of set off a post-Cold War era, an era of globalization. All of those key challenges that were there, the future of neoliberalism, what trade is going to look like, what international relations are going to look like. That's all up for grabs, and with a stark difference in views. And as I say, a difference in views that sort of, if implemented in policy, means two very different directions.
Dr. Karen Young, Senior Research Scholar, Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. Dr. Karen, I mention it's the gasoline price, stupid, in the sense that this election cycle, because you hear a lot, like Rad has said there, and particularly on the CNNs and the sense of the liberal end of the media, if one wants to use such language, how consequential all of this is. But at the same token, is it not just the basics? The American people, what's in my gasoline price? What's my job? What's my 401k? They don't even know how to spell the word consequential, I think. And ultimately, this is an election that is really about the basics. And on the basics, Biden looks pretty good, no?
Well, I don't think U.S. voters are all stupid to start, but I agree with Rod's kind of
Just
general
about
view.
how many of them? No, most electors are stupid. I mean, let's be honest here, right? At the end of the day, they have a sentiment, energy. They're not, they're looking at the basics, as we all do, right? I mean, this is
Yes,
not a unique
yes.
experience. Ultimately, I'm trying to get an understanding because from this distance, there is a lot of pollution around, obviously, the Trump trauma. We all live with Trump trauma, but ultimately, a lot of us around the world are starting to think there isn't much difference between Biden and Trump, particularly with the consequential events that are happening in the Middle East. The man should be in The Hague for genocide. So, from a global point of view, this is a complicated situation as how we view things. But from the ground in America, it's the gasoline price. Why is it more than that? Is it more than that? That's what we're trying to get an understanding of.
So I would say that it is a consequential election, but it's not necessarily in the control, the outcome in terms of where global trade goes, where the next ism that defines the era we're walking into. That's really under the control of either potential candidate. And you're also right. This is, like most U.S. presidential elections, about the domestic economy. And generally, what defines, sort of the outcome of elections is how people feel about GDP growth, how people feel about employment and opportunities for employment, and headline inflation. And so that's where the gas price comes in. It's really in that question of those immediate volatilities of your energy price and your food price. And so right now, I think we have a pretty low risk of recession. We have a kind of stable and frankly quite low and under-evaluated risk towards oil prices. So this is not a foreign policy election, but it is, I think, an election that is vulnerable to wild shifts in foreign policy. And so you mentioned, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the war in Gaza. That does matter more, I think, particularly to young voters. It's become a social justice issue in the United States, but it's not necessarily a motivating factor for most voters, with the exception of perhaps in Michigan, where we have a large Arab American population. But it's not going to be, a deciding factor in any of the kind of key swing states. I'd also say that this is a timing issue. So it's January. A lot can change between now and the summer and into the fall. And so on that key kind of price sensitivity, particularly on oil prices that translates to gasoline prices at the pump, still a lot could change. So I think the Biden administration is probably, though sitting in a good position right now, quite wary of spoilers, of potential actions and actors that could change that scenario.
Rachel Ziemba, founder at Ziemba Insights. Rachel, I'm just going to push back a little bit. Rad won't mind me using him as a little bit of a punching bag until he gets his next chance to punch back. But the idea that the Democrats, that somehow the change in government to Republican maybe more accommodating to hydrocarbons, I find it very, very strange how that narrative is bedded in. I mean, narratives do bed in. OPEC bad, consumers good. I mean, Arabs bad, others good. All sorts of narratives bed in the world. One of them is Democrats bad for energy, Republicans good. And yet the Democrats gave us, the explosion of shale. I mean, they gave us under their watch under Obama. We went doubled oil production.
Mhm.
Under Obama, the oil exports from the United States, probably one of the most consequential changes in energy policy in America. Now we have the LNG revolution. So I'm wondering, ultimately, does it really make a difference going forward into this election vis-a-vis the energy outcome if indeed the Democrats or the Republicans come back?
So I think it does make a difference, and especially in some of the ways that Rod mentioned in terms of direction of travel on clean energy, and then the whole package, right? There's also a number of things. I mean, I'm
but
less
the energy
concerned
industry
about
loves the IRA. I mean, Trump isn't going to take away.
They do. They do, but
Trump's not
they're
going to take away the
yeah.
trough from Houston. Come on.
Well, they're not going to take away the trough in Houston, but I think you could see certain things clawed back on the wind side. Also, some of the other sort of next steps to actually implement. There's a lot of details on hydrogen that are still being, but I mean, I take your point, and I think some of this is an issue of narrative, right? On the one hand, you know, if you look back a year ago, the Biden administration, in my view, was, you know, very publicly worried about the gas price, perhaps with some good reason, perhaps with there was a lot of hand wringing, you know, the framing around the visit to Saudi Arabia, which in some ways was a reset of what had been an attempt to completely freeze MBS out. And if now I think they're in a position where they can't take credit for this record, you know, sort of liquids production out of the United States. And it's not only about them, it's partly about them. It's partly about OPEC dynamics. It's partly about assessment of demand at post-pandemic, right? Reopening, some greater sort of certainty there. It's also that adjustment after private equity sort of squeezing, you know, sort of some in consolidation in the oil patch. So there's a lot of things that have come together. But I think there's a narrative ambivalence and challenge. Now, broadening that out, I think the Biden administration and the campaign have really struggled to get the message out on the fact that the economy is improving, the economy is not as bad as it was. Now, some of that might be a media narrative, some of that is what people really feel. And I think that increase in that inflation story is not only a matter of oil and gas, right? I mean, you could argue they've come down, but it's also all the other services, and some of it's a function that the economy shifted from one where we had massive supply chain shortages on the goods side when everybody was at home and after, to consumption of services. So people are looking at higher healthcare costs. They're looking at a variety of things. So I think you end up with a circumstance where, but back to your point, I mean, what could we see shifting? You know, we might see some permitting reform in a Republican administration. I figure a next Democratic administration would need to do something there. I also tend to think that you might not, I think new legislation relating to energy would be less likely to sort of subsidize and use government balance sheets, and maybe more likely to do kind of cross the board tax cuts. The other thing that I'm watching, and some of this is a political issue, goes back to a point that Karen just made about young people and others, but is what's going to happen on the LNG export side. Right. You know, we saw, I think yesterday or the day before, some news that there was going to be a new environmental review. Now, I don't think the US is going to ban LNG exports. They're going to find a way to finesse this. But it adds to this sort of narrative challenge and policy certainty at a time when, if, you know, we're also seeing the U.S. not able to appropriate support, financial support for Ukraine. There's a lot of mixed narratives here. And I think this reinforces the fact of the risk of some sort of event that leaves the administration reactive over the year. We've already seen, you know, a lot of pushback on sort of the sanctions relief to the extent it's been done on Iran and Venezuela in different ways. We could get into how much of that was the electoral cycle. You know,
sanctions in paper. I think sanctions in paper. But Rod,
but there was actual sanctions relief on Venezuela.
Yes,
right?
yes,
I think that's not on paper.
Yeah. Everybody needs an extra barrel of oil. Rod, I wanted to come back to the Eurasia Group's #1 risk for 2024. which is the United States versus itself. The idea that we get us living in the outer regions of the Roman Empire understand the consequence of this election. In essence, I mean, there is, as I said in my earlier comments, some sense of struggling to see the difference at the moment because emotions are high, but ultimately we understand the global consequence. What I'm trying to understand is the consequence for within America, because that's really has the ramifications in a sense for where the tremors go from there. So when you think of the U.S. versus itself as your number one risk, how does that play out within America, whoever wins or however this thing goes?
I think the sort of notion of that risk, and it goes to something that both Karen and Rachel have mentioned as well, is just how divided and just how polarized US society is at this moment in time, and how divided and how polarized the US electorate is, and indeed the political parties. I mean, the political parties are more polarized now than they have been since the Civil War. This is a situation where divisions are rife. And where
I again just want to. I think it's important because I know living in America, obviously, you're obviously dealing with all these things in a very immediate sense. But I am always reminding people in our little dinner party chats here that the 60s in America were pretty substantial. I mean, Kennedy was killed, Robert Kennedy was killed, John, Martin Luther King was killed. There's the Vietnam War. I mean, we've had some pretty big. Nixon resigned. It's a lot. There's big things have happened before. Is this bigger than all of that?
I think it probably is in many ways. I mean, look, you went through an era in the 1960s where you were able to get legislation on civil rights, where you were able to sort of make significant gains on other social and political issues. You had an element of cross the aisle cooperation. You didn't have the sort of grenade throwing, flamethrower approach to politics that exists right now. I mean, in many ways, US politics is paralyzed. And I think the risk that we see is twofold. One, going into this election, that paralysis, and as it impacts policymaking, is going to persist. You can see it just in the last 24 hours, where a Republican in the House is now thinking of alleging that Joe Biden is responsible for insurrection. On what particular basis, it's not clear. But what you have is this very, very divided sort of mudslinging politics, and that gets in the way of effective policymaking. It makes legislation virtually impossible. It means that you have constant targeting, particularly using the courts of, regulatory authorities, of decisions that are made. And fundamentally, you have an American people who are so divided that they don't agree with each other on the basics in many ways. And that's what this election is going to end up being fought over. The circus you mentioned will feed that. The circus is a manifestation of that. But US politics, I mean, I think just in our small dinner parties, one of the things to bring is this isn't subtleties or nuance. This is a reality of what remains a global superpower, essentially eating itself alive, and doing so in such a way that has consequences for policy and consequences for the rest of the world.
If we still had good newspaper cartoonists, that eating themselves alive could be quite an interesting one. Maybe there's
something to add to the energy outlook.
Dr. Karen mentioned there a little earlier about the growing sort of exhaustion or with the funding of the Ukrainian defense against Russia, and the even mix that into the politics around the possibility of LNG exports being suspended or coming under some duress. Obviously, Europe has become dependent on that to a great extent in this current moment. So my question leads to, what is the possibility in your calculation that Europe turns back to Russia for its gas supply. I mean, at the end of the day, Austria is still taking most of its gas from Russia. Hungary is still taking most of its gas from Russia, etc. What's the possibility? What do you think that looks like going forward?
So it was Rachel actually who mentioned the kind of movement towards environmentalists concerned about U.S. LNG exports and the construction of new LNG facilities. I agree with her. I don't think that that is a real near-term risk. And frankly, Europe is extremely dependent on U.S. exports of LNG right now. And I don't think that as a foreign policy choice that the Biden administration or even a Trump administration would be interested in threatening that. But as I said before, this is not a foreign policy election, but there are foreign policy issues that could certainly impact domestic politics and consensus and sentiment here inside the US. And so those actors, include Russia, who could be spoilers, but it's also those actors that are going to find themselves in a very good bargaining position for the kinds of things they want. And so that's actors like Saudi Arabia. Over the near term in the summer, we will see Saudi Arabia in a very good bargaining position on asks like nuclear energy cooperation, on security cooperation guarantees, in exchange for support of perhaps a Palestinian state, but one that they ultimately won't hold responsibility for a failure, because that will be on the Israeli government's plate. And potentially in whatever a very dysfunctional United Nations and international system can provide in terms of security and guarantee. So, the actors that really could change our outlook in the next 6 to 8 months include Russia as a spoiler on energy markets in perhaps coordination with OPEC and OPEC plus members. And certainly the kind of outlook on Iran and how the conversation within the election changes on, who is our biggest threat? Is it China? Is it potentially a conflict with Taiwan? Is it about trade issues? Or is it with Iran as the motivating factor of unrest in the Middle East? And you already hear this conversation coming out of Republican circles. You certainly, consistently hear it from people like John Bolton. And if we get to an election, as Rod mentioned, it might not be the candidates we think it is, right? If we get to an election that's a Haley-Harris election or a Biden-Haley election, Iran will become more of a central focus.
Is that, what are the odds of that other than the two granddads?
It's a small, I think, possibility, but a very real one, right? We have aged candidates. I think Haley is actually doing quite well in terms of her fundraising. And, depending on where the former President Trump goes in his legal battles, we could see a very last minute Republican convention that puts her forward. What are the odds on that?
See, I told it, 1968, this is the 60s.
Yeah, I mean, there are those upheavals. I mean, hopefully no one gets shot, right?
Well, yeah, no Kent State.
There are those upheaval possibilities. But, going back to the kind of first instance, what do voters care about? It is the economic issues. It's the headline inflation. It's the perception of GDP growth and the perception of employment opportunities. What
all of that seems to be
outside forces can change that? Those still become China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Russia. And that's on oil and gas prices in some ways, but it's also about trade. So if we have another supply chain scare, whether that's, in transit through the Bab el-Mandeb and the Suez, but more likely about what happens in a threat to Taiwan or just movements within the Chinese economy, which we can't really have any control over, that will be an impact for US voters.
Just the survey question popped up there, which is sort of along the themes that we are talking. Rachel, I just wanted you to also weigh in on that. This gas LNG strategy, of course, has been built a lot in recent years on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Biden coming across promising LNG. But all of it looks very tentative, right? These are spot cargoes going into floating regasification units in Europe. Now there is a blown up pipeline, which we now kind of understand why that was done. But the idea that how locked in is this particular equation? And you mentioned some of the vulnerabilities on the American side. I mean, my sense is I don't see why the European, I mean, if there's a deal going to be done, there's a deal done, everybody does a deal and they're happy. What's your sense of how locked in this current trade is between US and Europe on LNG and the likelihood or possibility that Europe turns back to Russia?
Before I do that, I just want to throw one more thing in that's really important in the election narrative. That amplifies what Karen and Rod have been talking about, and that's migration, right? The massive flows of people from, I mean, especially the Americas, Central America, but also Chinese and Africans and others. And so I think from away, it's, I think, really important to emphasize how important that is, especially in some democratic states.
Yeah.
And so I think that piece, that's going to be something that we're already seeing that kind of be a weaponization tool sort of in foreign appropriations and military. But I think that's something sort of very much to watch and think about. And I could see, particularly in a future Trump administration, you know, Trump threatening to sort of weaponize energy flows to Mexico. He's not going to do it, but on those sort of grounds, right? I have debates about that with my Mexico-based colleagues. Anyway, so just something on, you know, to put on that radar, very, you know, sort of very important. On the LNG side, here, I think we also have to think about the role that China plays, and we have to think about the role that European energy transition goals play. So one of the challenges for Europe was that until very recently, they weren't willing to sign medium or long-term natural gas contracts, right? They're in this context of, well, we don't want to buy from Russia. We're going to need things for, you know, a decade or so. But so they're starting to sign those deals. They're signing them with Qatar. They're signing them, you know, we can get into, well, we won't have time to get into that. But this has been a very recent sort of phenomenon. I mentioned China as well, because yes, there's spot cargoes going into Germany. There's others, but some of the reason why there are more natural gas molecules available to go into Europe is because China is buying more pipe gas from Russia. China is using, in some ways, less natural gas. And so one of the key things I continue to watch is China as a reseller of natural gas, but also China as, you know, a seller of refined oil products. And that's going to be something, maybe this isn't the sort of key inflection point year, but that's going to be something more important. And add to that, I mean, Karen talked about the risk of supply chain disruption. Sorry, talking too fast. But
we like talking fast here. This is the talking fast show.
Well, yeah, but you don't want me tripping over my tongue.
If you leave one breath, I'm right in there.
But you know, critical mineral supply chains, clean energy supply chains, and we're already seeing China, in a sense, mirroring what the U.S. is doing on semiconductor high-level inputs, but doing that on the clean energy side with graphite, with germanium and gallium. Now, some of that, the items are still getting out there, but I do think that as you have the US and Western countries trying to belatedly build out their domestic supply chains in these highly mineral intensive energy transition sectors that we're talking about, there's a lot more scope for other entities also weaponizing
and that's certainly a very big, that's the subject of the next panel, who are waiting in the green room in 2 minutes to jump into your boxes. But I just wanted to quickly close out with a rapid round fire of, you know, what is the yes/no question to ask on this point? It's not who's going to win the election, but ultimately the idea that is there any chance that Trump falls because of these legal battles? Is that, what's your gut on that? And we'll do a quick round on that. Just yes, no. Rad, starting.
If I was a lawyer, I'd be earning a lot more money than I do.
Yeah.
There's always a risk.
We all would.
I mean, I think it fundamentally comes down to the Supreme Court.
Yeah. Good answer. Karen?
I agree.
Yeah.
You know, it's, but I also think I would reserve the possibility that we see a last minute shift, that the Republican Party grows some integrity, or that we just see a a bombshell of an announcement that, or that
if Trump goes,
out.
if Trump goes, does Biden go?
That's a great question. Not unless he really has to. It would have to be a major health event, as they say.
Right. Rachel, last yes,
Yeah.
no to you on that.
Yeah, always a chance, but it's probably not the baseline scenario. I think on the Trump, I mean, look, clearly Biden still, or one of the reasons Biden's still in this race is because of the threat of Trump. But I worry that they will be so last minute, but that by that time, the Democrats won't want to change their ticket again, unless unless there's a health event or something like that. Because I think the challenge would be, and we don't wish that. And I think the challenge would be who replaces him, right?
Yes,
and in that context, obviously, vice president would be, sort of in line, but again, sort of narratives and polling and other things. So,
there's certainly,
we'll see. But it's a long way till November.
That it is a long way till November. That is the ultimate point to end with here. It is January the 10th. Rachel Ziemba, Dr. Rad Al-Qadiri, Dr. Karen Young, thank you for being such great sports and taking my prodding and pushing and devil's advocate on all of these issues. Really appreciate it. Thank you very much. And we look forward to joining us through the year on our regular podcast show. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Sean.
Cheers, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
All the best.